The fire had long since died when Serafina opened her eyes to the pre-dawn cold. Frost crept across the walls of her makeshift shelter, a hollowed crevice in the mountainside barely wide enough to lie down in, and her breath came out in pale clouds that dissipated into the darkness. Her fingers were numb despite being tucked beneath her arms, and her stomach ached with the familiar gnawing of hunger that had become her constant companion. She had eaten yesterday, a handful of dried berries and a small portion of smoked rabbit she'd managed to trap 3 days prior, but it was never enough. It was never supposed to be enough. Survival, she had learned, was not about comfort or satiation. It was about enduring one more night, one more dawn, one more breath in a world that had decided long ago she did not belong. She sat up slowly, her joints protesting with sharp stabs of pain. At 22, she felt decades older, her body bearing the accumulated weight of years spent alone in the wilderness, cast out and forgotten. Her fingers found the threadbare blanket she'd salvaged from an abandoned trader's cart months ago, and she wrapped it around her shoulders as she crawled toward the narrow opening of her shelter. Outside, the world was still cloaked in the deep blue of early morning, the snow-covered peaks of the Black Pine Ranges glowing faintly under a sky beginning to lighten at the edges. The wind howled through the gorges, carrying with it the scent of pine and ice and something else, something that made her wolf stir uneasily beneath her skin. Serafina had learned not to ignore her instincts. They were all she had left. She emerged from the crevice and stood, her bare feet sinking into the snow. The cold bit at her skin, but she barely registered it anymore. Pain had become background noise, a dull hum she had trained herself to push aside. She reached back into the shelter and retrieved her worn leather satchel, the one possession she guarded above all else. Inside were her tools of survival, small pouches of dried herbs, strips of cloth for bandaging, a flint stone, a bone knife with a chipped edge, and a water skin she'd patched so many times the original material was barely visible. Everything she owned could fit in that bag, and everything she owned had been scavenged, stolen, or earned through brutal necessity. She was an Omega, a rejected Omega, and in the hierarchy of the werewolf world, that made her less than nothing. The memory surfaced unbidden, as it always did in the quiet moments before the day truly began. She had been 17 when her presentation came, the biological shift that marked every young wolf's transition into adulthood and revealed their secondary gender. She remembered the anticipation, the hope that had flickered in her chest despite the warnings her mother had whispered to her in the dark. Her mother, who had died when Serafina was only 14, had been an Omega too, bonded to a Beta who treated her with indifference at best and cruelty at worst. Serafina's father had disappeared before she could remember him, abandoning her mother when the Pax Alpha had decided that Omega bloodlines were too weak to warrant protection or resources. Serafina had grown up on the edges of the Silver Moon Pack, a small but prideful group that controlled a fertile valley south of the Black Pine Ranges. She had been given the scraps of their meals, the coldest corner of the communal den, and the hardest tasks that no one else wanted. She hauled water from the frozen creek, cleaned the blood and waste from the butchering grounds, and gathered firewood until her hands bled. She was tolerated because her mother had been useful. An Omega's calming presence could soothe fractious wolves and ease tensions during pack gatherings. But Serafina herself had always been seen as a burden waiting to be confirmed. When her presentation came, the entire pack had gathered to witness it. Presentations were public events, a way to solidify hierarchy and assign roles. Alphas were celebrated, Betas were accepted, and Omegas were pitied, or in rare cases claimed by a high-ranking Alpha who saw value in their bond. Serafina had hoped, foolishly, that she might present as a Beta. It would have been enough. She could have stayed. She could have carved out a small, quiet life and avoided the fate her mother had endured. But when the shift came, when her wolf emerged fully for the first time and her scent flooded the gathering, there had been no celebration. Only silence, and then laughter. She had presented as an Omega, but not just any Omega. Her scent was weak, barely perceptible even to those standing close. Her wolf was small, almost fragile, with a coat the color of moonlight and eyes too pale to command respect. The Pax Alpha, A brutal man named Gregor Ironpaw had stepped forward and circled her, his lips curled in disgust. He had declared her unclaimed and unworthy of bonding, too weak to produce strong offspring, too insignificant to serve any purpose within the pack structure. He had given her a choice, though it was no choice at all: leave willingly or be driven out by force. Serafina had left that night with nothing but the clothes on her back and her mother's satchel. She had not looked back. That had been 5 years ago. 5 years of learning to survive in the wilderness alone, without pack, without protection, without the bonds that every wolf was supposed to need. She had taught herself to hunt small game, to identify herbs and roots that could heal or harm, to read the weather and the land. She had become a ghost, moving through the forests and mountains unnoticed, avoiding other wolves and the territories they claimed. She had learned that loneliness was safer than companionship, that silence was better than rejection, and that the only person she could rely on was herself. But survival was not living. It was simply not dying. Serafina adjusted the satchel on her shoulder and began her descent down the narrow trail that led away from her shelter. The path was treacherous, lined with loose stones and patches of ice, but she had walked it so many times that her feet found their way without conscious thought. Her destination today was the same as it had been for the past week: the lower slopes near the Black Pine Cliffs, where winterroot grew in the crevices between rocks. Winterroot was a hardy plant that thrived in the coldest months, its bulbous roots rich with nutrients and its leaves useful for treating frostbite and infection. It was one of the few things she could gather reliably during the deep winter, and she had a small stash of it drying in her shelter, ready to trade if she ever dared approach one of the human settlements on the kingdom's border. The humans of Valenreach were wary of wolves, but they were not outright hostile. They had their own problems: bandit raids, harsh winters, the distant threat of war with neighboring kingdoms, and they cared little for the internal hierarchies of werewolf packs. Serafina had traded with them a handful of times, always in secret, always careful to hide her wolf nature. She would leave bundles of herbs at the edge of a village and return the next day to find coins or food left in their place. It was a fragile system, built on anonymity and mutual need, but it had kept her alive. As she reached the base of the trail and began making her way through the dense pine forest that blanketed the lower slopes, the wind shifted. Serafina froze mid-step, her wolf senses flaring to full alertness. The scent that reached her was faint but unmistakable: blood, and not the blood of prey. This was wolf blood, thick and coppery, carried on the wind from somewhere to the north. Her first instinct was to turn back. Blood meant danger. It meant conflict, wounds, death, things she had learned to avoid at all costs. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the healer's instinct her mother had passed down to her, the ingrained need to help, even when it was foolish to do so. She stood there for a long moment, torn between self-preservation and something she couldn't quite name. Then she heard it, a low, pained growl, barely audible over the wind. Serafina's heart clenched. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, already knowing she was going to regret this. Then she turned north and began to run. The forest blurred around her as she moved, her feet barely touching the ground. She had spent years learning to navigate these woods, and she used every bit of that knowledge now, leaping over fallen logs, ducking beneath low-hanging branches, following the scent of blood as it grew stronger. It led her deeper into the forest, farther from her shelter and the relative safety of isolation, and toward a part of the Black Pine Ranges she rarely ventured into, a place where the cliffs grew steep and the caves ran deep. The scent of blood became overwhelming, mingling with the sharper smell of fear and the acrid tang of burned wood. Serafina slowed as she approached a rocky outcrop, her breath coming in short gasps. She could hear movement now, the scrape of claws on stone, labored breathing, and the low murmur of voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones. She crept forward, staying low, and peered around the edge of the outcrop. What she saw made her blood run cold. There were 12 of them, 12 wolves, all in their human forms, sprawled across the entrance of a large cave carved into the cliffside. They were warriors. That much was obvious from the armor they wore. Leather and metal plates bearing a sigil she recognized even from a distance. A crowned wolf's head surrounded by a circle of stars. The mark of the Alpha King. Seraphina's breath caught. The Alpha King. The ruler of all the northern packs. The most powerful alpha in the known world. A figure spoken of in whispers and legends. She had never seen him. Never even been close to anyone who served him. But she knew his sigil. Every wolf in the north knew it. And these warriors were dying. She could see it in the way they moved, slow and sluggish, their bodies slumped against the rocks. Their armor was torn and bloodied, their faces pale and drawn. Some of them were unconscious, others barely clinging to awareness. The snow around the cave entrance was stained red, and the air reeked of death. Seraphina should have left. She should have turned and run, and never looked back. These were not her people. They were not her responsibility. She was a rejected Omega with no pack, no status, no protection. If anyone discovered she had been here, if anyone learned she had even seen these warriors, she could be accused of anything. Espionage, betrayal, worse. She could be executed without trial. But as she watched, one of the warriors, a woman with short dark hair and a gash across her temple, turned her head and looked directly at Seraphina. Their eyes met. And in that moment, Seraphina saw something that shattered her resolve. Desperation. Hope. A plea without words. Seraphina cursed under her breath and stepped out from behind the outcrop. The reaction was immediate. Several of the warriors who were still conscious tensed, hands moving toward weapons they were too weak to wield. But the dark-haired woman raised a hand, stopping them, and spoke in a voice rough with pain. "Please," she said, "if you have any mercy, help us." Seraphina hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to flee. But the healer in her, the part of her that her mother had nurtured despite everything, would not let her walk away. She took a step forward, then another, until she was standing at the mouth of the cave. "I'm not your enemy," she said quietly. Her voice was hoarse from disuse. She rarely spoke anymore, and when she did, it was only to herself. "But I'm not strong enough to carry you, and I have very little in the way of supplies." "We don't need you to carry us," the woman said. "We just need something to stop the bleeding, something to keep us alive until our reinforcements arrive." Seraphina's gaze swept over the group, cataloging injuries with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years learning to survive on the edge of death. Burns, deep lacerations, broken bones, infections setting in from wounds left untreated for too long. These warriors had been ambushed, and whoever had done it had been thorough. "Your reinforcements," Seraphina said slowly. "When are they coming?" The woman hesitated, and that hesitation told Seraphina everything she needed to know. There were no reinforcements, or if there were, they had no idea where to look. "I see," Seraphina said. She set down her satchel and knelt beside the nearest warrior, a young man whose leg was bent at an unnatural angle. "Then I'll do what I can. But you need to understand, I'm not a miracle worker. If infection has set in, if bones have been shattered beyond repair, there's only so much I can do." "Anything," the woman said. "Anything is better than dying here like animals." Seraphina nodded and opened her satchel. She pulled out her supplies, laying them out on a flat rock. Dried yarrow for stopping bleeding, comfrey root for broken bones, strips of cloth for bandaging, a small vial of honey she'd traded for months ago that could fight infection. It was pitifully little, barely enough for 1 or 2 people, let alone 12. But she had made a choice, and she would see it through. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon, moving from warrior to warrior, cleaning wounds, setting bones, applying poultices and bandages with hands that trembled from exhaustion. The warriors watched her in silence, too weak or too stunned to speak. She did not ask their names, and they did not offer them. She was not there to make friends or forge alliances. She was there to keep them alive. It was only as the sun began to set and she was bandaging the last of the warriors, a massive man with a scar across his jaw who had not regained consciousness, that she realized she was being watched. She looked up and met the gaze of another wolf, one who had been lying so still against the back wall of the cave that she had assumed he was dead. His eyes were open now, pale gold and piercing, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her wolf recoil. He was different from the others. Older, perhaps in his early 30s, with sharp features and dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. His armor bore the same sigil as the others, but his was more ornate, the metal inlaid with patterns that seemed to shift in the firelight. And his scent, gods, his scent was overwhelming. It was the scent of power, of dominance, of an alpha so strong that every instinct in Serafina's body screamed at her to submit. But she did not submit. She held his gaze, her hands still working to tie off the bandage on the unconscious warrior's arm, and said nothing. "Who are you?" the man asked. His voice was low and rough, but there was no hostility in it, only curiosity. "No one," Serafina said. "Just a healer passing through. Healers don't usually travel alone," he said. "Especially not in these mountains, especially not in winter. I'm not like most healers." The man studied her for a long moment, and Serafina had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing far more than she wanted to reveal. Then he said, "You're an Omega." It was not a question. It was a statement, flat and certain, and it sent a jolt of fear through her. She had been careful to suppress her scent, to keep her wolf hidden, but this man, this alpha, had seen through her defenses as easily as peeling back a curtain. "I am," she said quietly. There was no point in denying it. "And yet you're here," he said. "Alone, helping wolves you don't know, who could just as easily kill you as thank you." "If you're going to kill me," Serafina said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest, "then do it. But let me finish this first." To her surprise, the man laughed. It was a short, bitter sound, but it was laughter nonetheless. "I'm not going to kill you," he said, "but I am curious. Why are you doing this?" Serafina tied off the final bandage and sat back on her heels, wiping the blood from her hands onto a scrap of cloth. "Because someone has to," she said simply, "and because I know what it's like to be left to die." The man's expression shifted, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, a low rumble echoed through the cave, and the ground beneath them trembled. Serafina's head snapped up. "What was that?" "Avalanche," one of the other warriors said weakly. "The cliffs aren't stable here. The ambush caused one earlier. That's how we ended up trapped in this cave." Another rumble, louder this time, and snow began to cascade down the face of the cliff outside the cave entrance. Serafina's stomach dropped. If the entrance was blocked, they would be sealed inside. And if that happened, they would all die. Slowly, from cold and starvation, or quickly, if the cave itself collapsed. "We need to move," she said, already gathering her supplies. "Now." But the warriors were too weak. Most of them could barely stand, let alone navigate the treacherous cliffs in the middle of an avalanche. Serafina looked at the man with the golden eyes, the one who seemed to be their leader, and saw the same realization in his face. They were trapped, and this time there was no easy way out. The rumbling grew louder, a deep grinding sound that seemed to come from the bones of the mountain itself. Serafina's wolf surged beneath her skin, panic flooding her senses, but she forced it down. Panic would kill her faster than the avalanche. She had to think. She had to find a way out. "Is there another exit?" she asked, her voice sharp and commanding despite her Omega status. Several of the warriors looked at her in surprise. Omegas did not give orders, did not speak with authority, but she ignored their reactions. Survival did not care about hierarchy. The dark-haired woman who had first pleaded with her shook her head weakly. "We searched when we first took shelter here. This cave only has one entrance. We were planning to move at dawn, but then the injuries. We couldn't." Serafina's mind raced. One entrance, 12 wounded warriors, an unstable mountain, and her, a lone Omega with no pack and no reinforcements coming. The odds were impossible, but she had survived impossible odds before. She moved to the cave entrance and peered out. The snow was falling heavily now, thick white sheets that obscured everything beyond a few feet. She could hear the grinding of ice and rock above them, the groan of snow shifting under its own massive weight. They had minutes at most before the entrance was completely blocked. "Can any of you shift?" she asked, turning back to the warriors. The man with the golden eyes, the one she suspected was their leader, shook his head. "Shifting requires strength we don't have. The ambush, they used wolfsbane in their weapons. It's still in our systems. We're lucky to be alive at all." Wolfsbane. That explained the severity of their conditions, the way their wounds refused to clot properly, the pallor of their skin. Wolfsbane was a poison that attacked a werewolf's very nature, preventing healing and weakening their connection to their wolf. In high enough doses, it was lethal. That these warriors had survived this long was a testament to their strength. But strength alone would not save them now. Seraphina made a decision. "I'm going to shore up the entrance," she said. "There are fallen logs outside, rocks we can use as braces. It won't stop an avalanche, but it might redirect the worst of it. Give us a chance." "You can't go out there alone," the golden-eyed man said, and there was something in his voice that made her pause. Not a command, but concern. "The snow will bury you in seconds." "Then I'll be fast," Seraphina said. She grabbed a length of rope from her satchel. She always carried rope, had learned its value 100 times over, and tied one end around her waist. She handed the other end to the dark-haired woman. "If the snow takes me, pull me back. Don't let go of this rope no matter what you hear." The woman took the rope with trembling hands. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "You don't know us. You owe us nothing." Seraphina met her eyes, and for a moment, she saw her mother's face superimposed over the warrior's features. Her mother, who had healed anyone who asked, who had given what little she had to those who needed it more, even when the pack gave her nothing in return. Her mother, who had died alone in the cold because no one had thought an Omega's life worth saving. "Because no one should die alone in the dark," Seraphina said quietly. Then she turned and plunged out into the storm. The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. Snow whipped around her, sharp as broken glass, and the wind tried to drag her off her feet. She could barely see a foot in front of her face, but she forced herself forward, using her hands to feel along the cliff face. She had seen the fallen logs earlier, before the storm had intensified. 3 large pines that had been knocked down by the earlier avalanche. If she could drag them to the entrance, wedge them against the rocks, it might create a barrier. It might be enough. Her fingers found the rough bark of the first log, and she grabbed hold of it, pulling with all her strength. It barely moved. The log was massive, waterlogged and heavy with snow, and she was just one small Omega with no pack strength to draw on. But she pulled anyway, her muscles screaming, her fingers going numb. She pulled until her vision began to blur, until she tasted blood in her mouth. And finally, the log shifted. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged it toward the cave entrance. The rope around her waist went taut, and she knew the warriors inside were helping as much as they could, pulling her back toward the cave, using the rope to guide the log. It was not much, but it was something. The rumbling above grew deafening. Seraphina did not look up. She could not afford to look up. She just kept pulling, kept moving, until the log was wedged against the entrance at an angle, one end braced against the cliff face, the other buried in the snow. It was not perfect, but it was a start. She went back for the second log, then the third. By the time she had all 3 in place, forming a crude lattice over the cave entrance, her hands were bleeding and her body was shaking so violently she could barely stand. But it was done. She had created a barrier, a framework that might redirect the avalanche's force instead of letting it pour directly into the cave. She stumbled back into the cave just as the mountain let out a roar that shook the world. The avalanche hit with the force of a god's wrath. Snow and ice and rock cascaded down the cliff face, a churning white mass that blotted out the sky. The logs Seraphina had positioned groaned and cracked under the weight, but they held. The snow piled up against them, forming a wall that diverted the worst of the avalanche to either side of the cave entrance. Debris rained down, chunks of ice and stone that clattered against the makeshift barrier, but the cave itself remained intact. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The silence that followed was absolute. Serafina lay on the cave floor, gasping for breath, her entire body aching. She could not feel her hands or feet, could not feel much of anything except the desperate primal relief of being alive. "You did it," someone said, voice filled with wonder. "You actually did it." Serafina did not respond. She did not have the strength. She just closed her eyes and let the darkness take her. When she woke, she was warm. That was the first thing she noticed. Warmth. It was such an alien sensation that for a moment she thought she was dreaming, or perhaps dead. But then she felt the rough texture of a blanket against her skin, smelled the acrid smoke of a fire, and realized she was still in the cave. Someone had moved her. Someone had wrapped her in blankets. Not her threadbare one, but thick, well-made wool that held heat like a living thing. Someone had built a fire, small and carefully tended, using wood she had not seen in the cave before. And someone had bandaged her hands, wrapping them in clean white cloth that smelled faintly of the comfrey root she had used on the warriors. She sat up slowly, her head spinning, and found herself looking directly into those golden eyes again. The man was sitting beside her, cross-legged, his back against the cave wall. He looked marginally better than he had before. There was color in his face now, and his breathing was steady, but he was still clearly wounded. A bandage wrapped around his torso, dark with old blood, and there were bruises along his jaw and neck that spoke of violence. "You should rest," he said. His voice was still rough, but there was a warmth to it now that had not been there before. "You pushed yourself too hard. Your body is in shock." "The others?" Serafina asked, her throat dry. "Alive, thanks to you." He gestured around the cave, and Serafina saw that the other warriors were sleeping, their breathing deep and even. The dark-haired woman was curled up near the fire, her head pillowed on her arm. The massive man with the scar across his jaw was awake, sitting watch near the entrance, his eyes alert despite his injuries. "The entrance is blocked," the golden-eyed man continued. "Completely sealed. We have air coming in through cracks in the rock, enough to breathe, but we won't be able to dig our way out, not in our condition." Serafina's stomach sank. "Then we're trapped. For now." He said it calmly, as if being buried alive in a mountain cave was only a minor inconvenience. "But the storm will pass, and when it does, our people will come looking for us. They know the route we were taking. They'll find us." "How long will that take?" Serafina asked. The man hesitated. "A few days? Maybe a week." "A week." Serafina looked around the cave, taking inventory. They had no food, no water except what they could melt from snow, and 12 injured wolves who needed care and rest to have any chance of surviving. "We'll need to ration everything," she said, already calculating. "Body heat will be essential. We'll need to stay close to conserve energy. I can melt snow for water, but we'll need to keep the fire small or we'll run out of wood, and the injured will need to stay as still as possible. Any movement will use energy we can't afford to waste." The man watched her as she spoke, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he said, "You're used to this, surviving with nothing." It was not a question, but Serafina answered anyway. "I've had practice." "How long have you been alone?" Serafina's jaw tightened. She did not want to talk about this, did not want to dredge up the memories that she had worked so hard to bury. But something about this man's gaze made it hard to deflect. There was no judgment in it, no pity, only a quiet, patient curiosity. 5 years, she said finally, "since my presentation." Understanding flickered across the man's face. "You were rejected. I was weak." The words came out flat, emotionless. She had said them so many times, to herself and to the few travelers she had encountered over the years, that they had lost their sting, or so she told herself. Too weak to bond, too weak to be useful. "My pack decided I wasn't worth the resources to keep." "Which pack?" "Silver Moon, south of here." The man's expression darkened. "Gregor Ironpaw." Serafina looked at him sharply. "You know him?" "I know of him. A petty tyrant who rules through fear and calls it strength." The disgust in the man's voice was palpable. "He's been reported to the council multiple times for violations of pack law, but he's careful." stays just within the boundaries of what's permissible. And rejecting a weak Omega is permissible, Seraphina said bitterly. It shouldn't be. The man's voice was hard now, edged with anger. But yes, technically, an Alpha has the right to refuse a bond if they deem it unsuitable. And an Omega without a bond has no legal standing within a pack. Seraphina said nothing. She had learned these laws the hard way, had felt their weight crushing her for 5 years. Hearing them spoken aloud did not make them any easier to bear. The man was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "My name is Alaric. Alaric Thorn." Seraphina froze. Thorn. The name echoed in her mind, and with it came the realization that had been lurking at the edges of her awareness since she had first seen his eyes. Alaric Thorn. The Alpha King. The ruler of all the northern packs. The wolf who commanded the loyalty of thousands. The legend made flesh. And she had just spent the last few hours dragging logs in a snowstorm to save his life. "I see you've heard of me," Alaric said, a wry smile touching his lips. Seraphina's mind raced. She should bow. She should avert her eyes, submit, show the deference that was expected when a low-ranking wolf addressed the Alpha King. But her body would not move. She was too tired, too cold, too overwhelmed by the absurdity of the situation. "I've heard of you," she said finally. "Everyone has. And yet, you didn't recognize me. You were covered in blood and barely conscious," Seraphina said dryly. "Forgive me for not noticing the crown." To her surprise, Alaric laughed. It was a genuine sound, warm and rich, and it seemed to fill the cave. Several of the sleeping warriors stirred at the noise, and the man with the scar glanced over with a faint smile. "I like you," Alaric said, still chuckling. "You don't bow, you don't scrape, you just say what you think." "I'm too tired to do anything else," Seraphina admitted. "Good. I'm tired of people who only tell me what they think I want to hear." Alaric shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at his injuries, and gestured to the space beside him. "Sit with me. Talk with me. We have time. And I find I'm curious about the Omega who saved an entire company of the King's Guard with nothing but rope and stubbornness." Seraphina hesitated, then moved to sit beside him. The warmth of the fire was intoxicating, and she found herself leaning toward it despite her better judgment. She was still cold, her body still shaking from the aftermath of the avalanche, and the heat was a mercy she could not resist. "There's not much to tell," she said. "I was rejected. I survived. That's all." "That's not all," Alaric said gently. "You learned to heal. You learned to navigate these mountains in winter. You learned to survive alone when every instinct in your body must have been screaming for pack, for connection. That takes more than stubbornness. That takes extraordinary strength." Seraphina looked at him, searching for mockery, for pity, for any sign that he was humoring her. But she found none. He was serious. He genuinely believed what he was saying. "I'm not strong," she said quietly. "If I were strong, I wouldn't have been rejected in the first place. Strength isn't measured by the size of your wolf or the power of your scent," Alaric said. "It's measured by what you do when the world tries to break you." "And you, Seraphina, may I call you Seraphina?" She nodded, too stunned to speak. "You, Seraphina, have been broken by the world, and yet here you are, dragging logs through an avalanche to save wolves you don't know, sharing supplies you can barely afford to spare, risking your life for strangers." He leaned closer, his golden eyes intent on hers. "That is strength, real strength, the kind that matters." Seraphina's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she was not strong, that she was just doing what anyone would do. But the words would not come, because deep down, in a part of herself she had tried to bury, she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that her life had meant something, that her suffering had not been for nothing. "Why were you traveling through the mountains?" she asked, desperate to change the subject. "The Alpha King doesn't usually move without a full army." Alaric's expression grew somber. "I was traveling in secret. There are tensions between the northern packs, old grudges, territorial disputes. I was on my way to meet with the leaders of the eastern territories, to negotiate a truce before things escalated into war. A small group, No banners, no fanfare. We thought discretion would be safer. But someone knew, Serafina said. Someone knew. Alaric's jaw tightened. We were ambushed in the pass, 2 days' journey from here. They came at night, a force of at least 30 wolves, well-trained and well-armed. They knew exactly where we would be and exactly when we would be most vulnerable. It was an assassination attempt, plain and simple. Who would dare attack the Alpha King? That, Alaric said grimly, is the question I intend to answer. Once we get out of here. Serafina was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she said, if someone wants you dead badly enough to orchestrate an ambush like that, they won't stop just because this attempt failed. They'll come looking. And when they find this cave, they'll find 12 wounded warriors and 1 very brave Omega. Alaric finished. He reached out, and before Serafina could react, took her bandaged hand in his. His touch was gentle, careful not to press on her injuries, which is why we need to make sure they don't find us. Not until we're strong enough to fight back. Serafina looked down at their joined hands, her heart pounding. She should pull away. She should maintain the distance that her status demanded. But she did not. She let him hold her hand, let herself feel the warmth of his skin against hers, and for the first time in 5 years, she did not feel quite so alone. Tell me about your mother, Alaric said softly. You mentioned her earlier. She was a healer too, wasn't she? And so Serafina talked. She talked about her mother, about the small kindnesses she had shown in a world that offered her none. She talked about the herbs her mother had taught her to identify, the remedies she had passed down, the quiet strength that had kept her going even when the pack treated her as less than nothing. She talked until her voice grew hoarse, until the fire burned low, and the cave was filled with the soft sounds of sleeping wolves. And Alaric listened. He listened as if her words mattered, as if her story was worth hearing, and when she finally fell silent, exhausted and empty, he squeezed her hand gently and said, "Thank you for trusting me with that." Serafina did not know what to say, so she said nothing. She just sat there, her hand in his, and let herself rest. The days that followed blurred together. Serafina tended to the wounded, changing bandages, monitoring for signs of infection, rationing the meager supplies she had brought. Alaric recovered slowly, his strength returning bit by bit, and as he did, he helped her. He fetched water, kept the fire going, talked to the other warriors to keep their spirits up. They fell into a rhythm, a partnership born of necessity and mutual respect. But the cave was still sealed, and their supplies were running out. On the 4th day, the dark-haired warrior, whose name Serafina had learned was Mira, developed a fever. It came on suddenly, her skin burning to the touch, her breathing shallow and rapid. Serafina examined the wound on her temple, the one she had cleaned and bandaged on that first day, and her heart sank when she saw the telltale signs of infection spreading beneath the skin. Red streaks radiated outward from the gash, and the flesh around it was hot and swollen. The wolfsbane is still in her system, Serafina said, kneeling beside Mira with her meager supplies laid out on the cave floor. It's preventing her body from fighting the infection naturally. I need to draw out the poison, but I don't have enough comfrey root left. I used most of it on the broken bones. Alaric crouched beside her, his expression grim. What do you need? Silverleaf, Serafina said. It grows in clusters near water sources, usually under rocky overhangs where the snow doesn't reach. It's one of the few plants that can counteract wolfsbane poisoning, but I'd have to go outside to find it, and we're buried under 10 feet of snow. Then we dig, Alaric said simply. Serafina looked at him incredulously. You can barely stand without wincing. And even if we could dig through the snow, it would take days. Mira doesn't have days. Then we work fast. Alaric stood and turned to address the other warriors, his voice carrying the weight of command that came so naturally to an alpha. Everyone who can move, we're digging. We create a tunnel through the snow, straight up and out. Serafina needs Silverleaf to save Mira's life, and we're going to get it for her. The warriors stirred, those who were conscious struggling to their feet despite their injuries. The massive man with the scar, whose name was Garrick, moved to stand beside Alaric, his jaw set with determination. 2 others, younger wolves barely out of their teens, pushed themselves up from where they had been resting, their faces pale but resolute. "You're all still recovering," Serafina protested. "If you push yourselves too hard, you'll undo all the healing. And if we don't push ourselves, Mira dies," Alaric said, cutting her off. His golden eyes met hers, and there was something fierce and unyielding in them. "You saved our lives, Serafina. Every single one of us would be dead if not for you. Now let us return the favor." Serafina wanted to argue, wanted to tell them it was foolish, that they were risking too much. But she saw the determination in their faces, the way they looked at Mira's unconscious form with a loyalty that transcended rank or reason. These were not just warriors. They were a pack, and a pack did not leave their own behind. "All right," she said quietly, "but we do this carefully. Short shifts, frequent rests. And if anyone starts to bleed through their bandages or shows signs of distress, they stop immediately. Understood?" The warriors nodded, and they set to work. They started at the cave entrance, where the logs Serafina had positioned created a small gap between the snow and the rock. Using their hands, pieces of broken wood, and sheer stubborn determination, they began to dig. The snow was packed hard, compressed by its own weight and the force of the avalanche. But they worked methodically, passing chunks of ice and snow back through the cave to be piled against the far wall. Serafina supervised, watching for signs of exhaustion or injury. Every hour she made them stop and rest, checked their bandages, forced them to drink water melted from snow. Alaric worked alongside his warriors, refusing to rest even when she ordered him to, and she found herself torn between frustration at his stubbornness and admiration for his refusal to ask anything of his people that he would not do himself. By the end of the first day, they had dug a tunnel barely 3 feet long. By the end of the second day, they had doubled that. Mira's fever worsened, her body shaking with violent chills even as her skin burned. Serafina did everything she could. Cold compresses to bring down the fever, willow bark tea to ease the pain, constant vigilance to make sure she kept breathing. But it was not enough. Without the silver leaf, Mira would die. On the morning of the 6th day, trapped in the cave, Garrick let out a shout that echoed through the tunnel. "I see light!" Serafina's heart leapt. She scrambled through the tunnel, squeezing past the exhausted warriors, and emerged into the narrow passage Garrick had carved. Above her, perhaps 2 feet away, was a small hole no bigger than her fist, and through it she could see gray sky and falling snow. "We're through," Garrick said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and triumph. "We just need to widen it enough for someone to fit through." "I'll go," Serafina said immediately. "I'm the smallest, and I know what the silver leaf looks like." "Absolutely not," Alaric said from behind her. He had followed her through the tunnel, his broad shoulders barely fitting in the tight space. "You're not going out there alone. The storm may have passed, but the mountain is still unstable. One wrong step and you could fall, or trigger another avalanche." "Then come with me," Serafina said, meeting his gaze. "But we need to move fast. Mira doesn't have much time." Alaric hesitated, then nodded. Together they worked to widen the hole, carefully removing chunks of snow and ice until the opening was large enough for a person to squeeze through. Serafina went first, pulling herself up and out into the blinding white landscape beyond. The world had been transformed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow that covered everything. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, but there was enough light to see by. Serafina oriented herself, looking for landmarks she recognized, and spotted the line of rocky outcrops that marked the path down to the lower slopes. If she remembered correctly, there was a stream that ran along the base of those rocks, fed by snowmelt even in winter. That was where she would find the silver leaf. Alaric emerged from the hole behind her, breathing hard from the effort. His face was pale, and Serafina could see the strain in the tight set of his jaw, but he did not complain. He simply stood beside her and said, "Lead the way." They moved quickly but carefully, their feet sinking into the deep snow with every step. Serafina's legs burned with the effort, her breath coming in short gasps, but she pushed forward. Behind them, the cave was a small dark opening in the white expanse, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. She memorized the landscape, fixing the location in her mind, terrified that they would lose their way back. It took them nearly an hour to reach the stream, and when they did, Serafina's heart sank. The water was frozen solid, the rocks covered in thick sheets of ice. There was no sign of the silverleaf, no clusters of the small silvery green plants she needed. "It's too cold," she said, despair creeping into her voice. "The plants can survive under snow, but not under ice. They need access to flowing water to stay alive." "Then we find where the water is still flowing," Alaric said. He pointed upstream, where the rocks formed a narrow gorge. "There, the gorge creates pressure, forces the water to move faster. It might not be frozen." They climbed, scrambling over ice-slicked rocks, clinging to each other for balance when the footing grew treacherous. Serafina's hands were numb again, her whole body shaking with cold and exertion. But she did not stop. She could not stop. Mira's life depended on this. And then, as they rounded a bend in the gorge, she saw it. A small section of the stream, no more than a few feet across, where the water still flowed. It was barely a trickle, half covered by ice, but it was moving. And growing in the rocks beside it, sheltered from the worst of the cold, were clusters of silverleaf. Serafina let out a sob of relief and stumbled forward, falling to her knees beside the plants. She pulled out her bone knife and began cutting, taking only what she needed, careful not to damage the roots so the plants could regrow. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the knife, but she managed to gather a dozen stems, enough to make the poultice and tea that would save Mira's life. "I've got it," she said, her voice breaking. "I've got it." Alaric knelt beside her, and when she looked at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was not just relief or gratitude. It was something deeper, something that made her wolf stir and whine softly in her chest. "You are remarkable," he said quietly. "Do you know that?" Serafina shook her head, unable to speak. She wanted to tell him she was not remarkable, that she was just doing what needed to be done, but the words would not come. Instead, she just looked at him, this powerful alpha who commanded armies, who ruled over thousands, and who was looking at her, a rejected Omega, as if she were something precious. "We should go back," she managed to say finally, "before we freeze." The journey back to the cave was harder than the journey out. They were both exhausted, their bodies pushed beyond their limits, and the snow seemed deeper, the cold more biting. Halfway back, Serafina stumbled and would have fallen if Alaric had not caught her. He pulled her against his side, supporting her weight, and they walked the rest of the way like that, two wolves clinging to each other in the vast white wilderness. When they finally tumbled back through the hole and into the tunnel, the other warriors surrounded them, pulling them down into the warmth of the cave, wrapping them in blankets, pressing cups of hot water into their hands. Serafina barely registered any of it. Her entire focus was on the silverleaf clutched in her frozen fingers. She went to work immediately, ignoring the protests of the warriors who wanted her to rest. She boiled water, crushed the silverleaf into a paste, mixed it with the last of her honey to make it palatable. She spread the paste over Mira's infected wound, packed it with clean cloth, and then brewed the remaining leaves into a strong tea. "Help me lift her," she said to Alaric, and together they raised Mira's head, coaxing the tea past her lips. Mira coughed and sputtered, but she swallowed, and Serafina felt a flicker of hope. "Now we wait," she said, sitting back on her heels. "The silverleaf should start counteracting the wolfsbane within a few hours. If the fever breaks by morning, she'll live." "And if it doesn't?" one of the younger warriors asked, his voice small and frightened. Serafina did not answer. She did not need to. They all knew what would happen if the fever did not break. The night was long and agonizing. Serafina sat beside Mira, monitoring her breathing, checking her pulse, changing the poultice every few hours. Alaric sat beside her, refusing to leave, and slowly the other warriors drifted off to sleep, exhausted from their labors. In the quiet darkness, with only the crackling of the fire for company, Alaric spoke. "You asked me once why I was traveling in secret," he said. "I told you I was trying to prevent a war, but that's not the whole truth." Serafina looked at him, waiting. There is corruption in the council, Alaric continued, his voice low and bitter. Alphas who care more about power than the welfare of their packs. They manipulate the laws, exploit the weak, and turn a blind eye to suffering because it doesn't affect them. I've been trying to reform the system, to create protections for omegas and low-ranking wolves, to hold alphas accountable for their actions. But there are those who see my reforms as a threat to their authority. That's why I was ambushed. Someone on the council wants me dead. That's why you were traveling without your full guard, Seraphina said, understanding dawning. You didn't know who you could trust. Exactly. These 12 warriors, he gestured around the cave, are the only ones I know beyond doubt are loyal. They've served with me for years, bled with me, nearly died with me. They're more than soldiers. They're my brothers and sisters. And now you're trapped in a cave because of me, Seraphina said quietly. Alaric turned to her, his expression fierce. Don't you dare, he said. Don't you dare blame yourself for this. You saved our lives. Without you, we would have died in this cave days ago. Without you, Mira would already be gone. But if I hadn't been here, you might have found another way. There was no other way, Alaric interrupted. Seraphina, look at me. She did, reluctantly. You are not a burden, he said, each word deliberate and heavy with conviction. You are not weak. You are not unwanted. You are strong and brave and capable, and anyone who made you believe otherwise is a fool. Seraphina's vision blurred with tears. She had not cried in years, had trained herself not to, but now the tears came unbidden, spilling down her cheeks. Alaric reached out and gently wiped them away with his thumb, and the tenderness of the gesture broke something inside her. I don't know how to be anything other than alone, she whispered. I don't know how to trust. How to hope. Every time I've tried, the world has taken it away. Then don't trust the world, Alaric said. Trust me. And in that moment, trapped in a cave beneath a mountain of snow, surrounded by wounded warriors and the ever-present threat of death, Seraphina made a choice. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against Alaric's shoulder, letting herself be held, letting herself be comforted. It was the first time in 5 years she had allowed anyone to touch her with kindness, and it felt like coming home. They sat like that for a long time, until the fire burned low and the cave was filled with the soft sounds of sleeping wolves. And when Seraphina finally pulled away, she saw something in Alaric's eyes that made her heart race. It was the beginning of a bond, fragile and uncertain, but real. As dawn broke on the 7th day, Mira's fever finally broke. She woke weak and disoriented, but alive. The infection had receded, the red streaks fading to faint lines beneath her skin. She would need rest and care, but she would survive. The warriors celebrated quietly, their relief palpable. Seraphina checked on each of them, assessing their progress, and was gratified to see that most were healing well. The wolfsbane was finally leaving their systems, their natural healing beginning to assert itself. In another few days, they would be strong enough to attempt the journey down the mountain. But their supplies were gone. The last of the silver leaf had been used on Mira, the last of the firewood burned. They had water, but nothing else. And while they could survive a few more days without food, it would leave them dangerously weak. We need to leave tomorrow, Alaric said that evening, addressing the group. We're running out of time. Our enemies will be looking for us, and if they find us here, we'll be trapped with no way to defend ourselves. Can everyone walk? Seraphina asked. Alaric looked around at his warriors, his expression thoughtful. Most of us, yes, but there are 3 who won't make it on their own. Broken ribs, shattered ankle, severe muscle damage. They'll need to be carried. Then we make stretchers, Garrick said. Use the logs from the entrance as frames. Tear up blankets for straps. It won't be comfortable, but it'll work. And we take it slow, Seraphina added. Frequent rests. We can't afford to have anyone collapse from exhaustion. They spent the rest of the evening preparing. Seraphina supervised the construction of the stretchers, making sure they were stable and would not cause additional injury. She redistributed the remaining bandages, made sure everyone's wounds were as clean and secure as possible. She worked until exhaustion threatened to pull her under, and even then she did not stop. Alaric found her in the early hours of the morning, sitting alone near the dying fire, staring into the embers. He sat down beside her without a word and handed her a cup of water. "You need to rest," he said gently. "Tomorrow will be hard. You'll need your strength." "I'm fine," Serafina said automatically. "No, you're not." Alaric's voice was kind but firm. "You're running on fumes. You've been taking care of everyone else and ignoring your own needs. When was the last time you ate?" Serafina frowned, trying to remember. "I don't know. A few days ago?" "Exactly." Alaric reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wrapped bundle. When he opened it, Serafina saw a piece of dried meat, carefully preserved. "I've been saving this, for emergencies. I'd say this qualifies." "I can't take that," Serafina protested. "You need it. I need you strong enough to guide us down this mountain," Alaric said, pressing the meat into her hand. "Please, Serafina, eat." She looked down at the meat, her stomach clenching with hunger she had been ignoring for days. Slowly, reluctantly, she took a bite. It was tough and salty, but it was food, and her body responded with desperate gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you," Alaric replied, "for everything." They sat in companionable silence, watching the fire fade to ash, and when Serafina finally allowed herself to sleep, she did so with Alaric's presence beside her, solid and reassuring in the darkness. The descent down the mountain began at first light. The warriors moved slowly, carefully, forming a protective line around the three who were carried on makeshift stretchers. Serafina led the way, picking the safest path through the treacherous snow-covered terrain, while Alaric brought up the rear, his golden eyes constantly scanning for threats. The air was crisp and cold, each breath burning in their lungs, but the storm had passed completely, leaving behind a crystalline sky that stretched endlessly above them. They had been walking for barely an hour when Serafina noticed the tracks. She stopped abruptly, her hand rising in a silent signal that froze the entire group. The tracks were fresh, no more than a few hours old, cutting across their path in a diagonal line that led toward the higher peaks. Wolf tracks, too many to count, and they were large, alpha-sized, moving with purpose and coordination. "How many?" Alaric asked quietly, moving to stand beside her. Serafina crouched down, examining the prints more closely. "At least 20, maybe more. They're organized, moving in formation. This isn't a hunting party. It's a search party," Garrick said grimly from behind them. "Looking for us." Alaric's jaw tightened. "Or looking to make sure we're dead." A tense silence fell over the group. The warriors exchanged glances, hands moving instinctively toward weapons they barely had the strength to wield. They were in no condition to fight. If the search party found them here, exposed on the mountainside, it would be a massacre. "We need to move," Serafina said, standing. "Get off this slope and into cover before they circle back." "Where?" one of the younger warriors asked, his voice tight with fear. "There's nothing but open ground for miles." Serafina closed her eyes, visualizing the terrain she had learned over 5 years of solitary survival. There was a place, a narrow ravine that cut through the lower slopes about half a mile to the east. It was dangerous, prone to rock slides and hidden crevasses, but it would provide cover. And more importantly, it would hide their scent. The ravine funneled wind in unpredictable patterns, making it nearly impossible to track someone through it by smell alone. "Follow me," she said. "Stay close and step exactly where I step. Don't deviate, don't explore. One wrong move in that ravine and you'll fall to your death." No one argued. They trusted her now, trusted her in a way that still felt foreign and overwhelming. Serafina pushed down the complicated feelings that rose in her chest and started moving, leading them away from the tracks and toward the ravine. The journey was agonizing. The stretcher-bearers struggled with their burdens on the uneven ground, slipping on ice, nearly dropping their charges more than once. Serafina had to stop frequently to find solid footing, to test the stability of the snow, to ensure they were not walking into a trap. Every moment felt like an eternity, every sound making them flinch and look around for pursuers. They reached the ravine just as the sun reached its zenith. The entrance was a narrow crack between two massive rock faces. barely wide enough for one person to squeeze through at a time. Inside, the ravine opened up into a winding passage that snaked through the mountain, its walls rising hundreds of feet on either side. "This is it," Seraphina said, gesturing to the entrance. "Once we're inside, we'll be hidden. But we have to move carefully. The rocks here are unstable, and sound echoes for miles. No talking unless absolutely necessary." The warriors nodded their understanding. One by one, they filed into the ravine, the stretcher-bearers maneuvering awkwardly through the tight entrance. Seraphina went first, testing each step, listening for the telltale crack of shifting stone. Behind her, she could hear the labored breathing of the warriors, the soft scrape of boots on rock, the occasional suppressed groan of pain. They had been moving through the ravine for perhaps 20 minutes when Seraphina heard it. A sound so faint she almost missed it. The distant echo of howls, carried on the wind from somewhere above them. The search party had found their trail. Seraphina's blood ran cold. She turned to look at Alaric, who had heard it too. His expression was grim but calm, the face of a leader who had been in impossible situations before and survived. "How long do we have?" he asked quietly. "Minutes," Seraphina whispered back. "Maybe less. If they follow our tracks to the ravine entrance, they'll know we're in here. And there's only one way out. The exit on the other side, about 2 miles ahead. Can we reach it before they catch up?" Seraphina looked back at the exhausted warriors, at the 3 on stretchers who could not move quickly no matter how desperate the situation. "Not all of us," she said honestly. "Not at the pace we're moving." Alaric was quiet for a moment, and Seraphina could see the calculations running behind his eyes. He was weighing options, considering strategies, preparing to make the kind of impossible choice that leaders were forced to make. "Then we split up," he said finally. "The strongest take the stretchers and move as fast as they can toward the exit. The rest of us stay behind and create a diversion. Lead the search party away." "That's suicide," Garrick said bluntly. "You're not strong enough to fight 20 wolves." "I don't need to fight them," Alaric said. "I just need to buy enough time for the others to escape. Once they're out of the ravine, they can reach the lower settlements, get help. But someone has to slow the search party down." "I'll stay," Seraphina said immediately. The words were out before she could think about them, driven by an instinct she did not fully understand. "I know this ravine better than anyone. I can lead them deeper into the unstable sections, make them think we're all running that way." "Absolutely not," Alaric said, his voice sharp with an authority that made several of the warriors straighten instinctively. "You're the one who needs to go with the stretchers. They'll need a healer when they reach safety. And you need someone who knows the terrain," Seraphina shot back, refusing to be cowed. "Someone who can navigate in the dark, who knows which paths are safe and which will collapse. That's me. You might be the Alpha King, but this is my mountain." Alaric's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. "Seraphina. She's right," Mira said weakly from her stretcher. She had been silent for most of the journey, conserving her strength, but now she pushed herself up on one elbow and looked at Alaric with clear, determined eyes. "If we're going to have any chance of making it out, we need her with us. And you need someone to stay behind who can actually outmaneuver a search party. Your Majesty, with respect, you're injured, you're exhausted, and you're not thinking clearly." A muscle twitched in Alaric's jaw. "Are you questioning my orders, Mira?" "I'm reminding you that you're not invincible," Mira said gently, "and that sometimes the best way to lead is to let others protect you." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with years of shared history and mutual respect. Seraphina watched the conflict play out on Alaric's face, the instinct to protect warring with the knowledge that Mira was right. "I'll stay with him," Garrick said, stepping forward. "I can fight, and I know how to follow orders. Between the 3 of us, we can lead them on a chase they won't forget." 3 against 20, one of the younger warriors said nervously. "Those aren't good odds." "Odds don't matter," Garrick said with a grim smile. "What matters is buying time. And we'll buy as much as we can." Alaric looked at Seraphina, and in his eyes she saw a desperation that pierced through all his alpha composure. "If you do this," he said quietly, his voice meant only for her. "If you sacrifice yourself for us." "I'm not sacrificing myself," Serafina interrupted. "I'm surviving, like I always have. I know every cave, every hidden passage, every escape route in these mountains. They won't catch me, but I need you to promise me something. Anything." "Get them to safety," Serafina said, nodding toward the other warriors. "All of them. And when this is over, when you've rooted out the corruption and secured your throne, remember that there are other Omegas out there like me. Rejected, abandoned, left to die. Change the laws that allowed that to happen. Make it so no one else has to spend 5 years alone in the wilderness just to prove they deserve to live." Alaric reached out and took her hand, his grip fierce and possessive. "I promise," he said. "On my life, on my crown, I promise. But you have to promise me something too." "What?" "Survive," Alaric said. "Whatever it takes, however long it takes. Survive. Because I'm coming back for you. Do you understand? I will come back for you." Serafina felt something twist in her chest, painful and sweet all at once. She wanted to tell him not to make promises he could not keep, wanted to remind him that she was just a rejected Omega, and he was the Alpha King, and their worlds were never meant to intersect. But the words would not come. Instead, she just nodded and squeezed his hand once before letting go. "We need to move," she said, her voice rough. "Now." The group split quickly, efficiently. Mira and the other 2 stretcher cases were secured more tightly, their carriers chosen from among the strongest of the remaining warriors. Serafina gave them detailed instructions, which paths to take, which landmarks to watch for, how to recognize the signs of unstable ground. She drew a rough map in the dirt, marking safe routes and danger zones, and made them repeat the directions back to her until she was satisfied they understood. "When you reach the exit, head south," she said. "There's a human settlement about 3 miles from the ravine mouth. They're cautious of wolves, but they're not hostile. Tell them you were attacked by bandits. Don't mention the Alpha King, don't mention the ambush. Just say you need shelter and medical care. They'll help you." "And you?" Mira asked. "I'll lead the search party north," Serafina said. "Into the deep ravines where the rock is unstable. With luck, I'll lose them in the maze. Without luck, well, at least I'll have bought you enough time." Mira's eyes were wet, but she did not cry. She just nodded and said, "Thank you for everything." The warriors began to move, filing deeper into the ravine, their footsteps echoing softly off the stone walls. Serafina watched them go, committing their faces to memory. These wolves who had started as strangers and had become something more. Family, perhaps. Or at least the closest thing to family she had known in 5 years. When the last of them had disappeared around a bend in the ravine, Serafina turned to Alaric and Garrick. "Ready?" "As we'll ever be," Garrick said, rolling his shoulders despite the obvious pain the movement caused. "What's the plan?" "We make noise," Serafina said. "A lot of noise. Make them think the whole group is heading north. Then we lead them on a chase through the most dangerous parts of the ravine. Places where one wrong step will send you falling into crevasses or trigger rock slides. They'll have to move carefully, which will slow them down. And while they're focused on us, the others will have time to escape. And when they catch up to us?" Alaric asked. Serafina met his gaze steadily. "They won't, because I know places in these mountains where even wolves fear to tread. Places where the rock is so unstable that a whisper can cause a collapse. We'll lead them to the edge of the abyss, and then we'll disappear." "You make it sound so simple," Garrick said with a wry smile. "It's not simple," Serafina admitted. "It's nearly impossible. But nearly impossible is better than certain death." She turned and started running, heading north deeper into the ravine. Behind her, she heard Alaric and Garrick follow, their footsteps deliberately heavy, designed to echo and carry. Serafina began to shout, her voice bouncing off the stone walls, multiplying until it sounded like a dozen wolves were running through the ravine instead of just 3. The response was immediate. From somewhere behind them, much closer than Serafina had anticipated, came answering howls. The search party had entered the ravine, and they were hunting. Serafina ran faster, her wolf senses stretched to their limits. She could hear the pursuit now, the sound of many feet pounding against stone, the harsh breathing of wolves in full chase. They were gaining. Of course they were gaining. They were fresh and well-fed and uninjured, while Serafina and her companions were half-starved and barely able to stand. But Serafina had advantages they did not. She knew this ravine. She had explored every inch of it over the years, mapping its dangers in her mind, and she was about to use that knowledge to its fullest extent. She led them through a section where the walls narrowed dramatically, forcing their pursuers to slow down and move single file. Then, through a maze of fallen boulders that required careful climbing, each rock potentially unstable. She could hear the search party behind them, cursing and shouting, the sounds of their pursuit growing more frustrated. "They're getting closer," Garrick panted from behind her. "I know," Serafina said. "Just a little farther. There's a place ahead. The Singing Stones, I call it. The rock there is honeycombed with caverns, and the whole structure is held up by a series of natural pillars. If we can get through it and destabilize the pillars behind us, we can seal the passage and trap ourselves on the other side," Alaric pointed out. "There's another way out," Serafina said. "A hidden passage that exits on the eastern slope. It's narrow and dangerous, but it's there. We just have to survive long enough to reach it." They rounded a bend, and the ravine opened up into a vast chamber. The walls here were riddled with holes like Swiss cheese, and strange whistling sounds echoed through them as the wind passed through the caverns. Standing like sentinels throughout the chamber were dozens of stone pillars, some as thick as tree trunks, others as slender as saplings. They rose from floor to ceiling, and Serafina knew from previous exploration that they were all that kept the ceiling from collapsing. "Don't touch the pillars," she warned. "Don't even breathe on them too hard. They're more fragile than they look." They moved into the chamber, picking their way carefully between the pillars. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. The search party was almost upon them. "Now," Serafina said. She grabbed a loose rock from the ground and, with all her remaining strength, threw it at one of the slender pillars near the entrance they had just come through. The rock struck true, and the pillar shattered with a sound like thunder. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan that seemed to come from the earth itself, the ceiling began to collapse. Serafina did not wait to see the results. She grabbed Alaric's hand and ran, pulling him deeper into the chamber as the world exploded into chaos behind them. Rocks fell like rain, dust filled the air, and the deafening roar of the collapse drowned out everything else. They burst through the far side of the chamber just as the entrance sealed itself behind them, tons of rock filling the space where they had been standing moments before. Serafina could hear screaming from the other side, muffled by the stone. The search party, caught in the collapse or trapped on the other side. "Keep moving," she gasped, her lungs burning. "The whole ravine could be unstable now. We need to get out before the rest of it comes down." They ran through the darkness, Serafina leading them by memory and instinct, her hands outstretched to feel the walls. The passage twisted and turned, growing narrower with each step, until they were squeezing through gaps barely wide enough for their bodies. Behind them, they could hear the rumble of continued collapses, the mountain reshaping itself in the wake of the destruction they had caused. And then, finally, Serafina saw light ahead. Not the gray light of the overcast sky, but the golden light of late afternoon sun, the eastern exit. They emerged onto a narrow ledge overlooking a steep drop. Below them, perhaps 200 feet down, was a pine forest blanketed in snow. The path down was treacherous, little more than a goat track carved into the cliff face. But it was there. "We made it," Garrick said, his voice filled with disbelief. "We actually made it." Serafina leaned against the rock wall, her body shaking with exhaustion and relief. "For now," she said. "But we're not safe yet. We need to get down this cliff and put as much distance between us and that ravine as possible. The search party might find another way around. Let them try," Alaric said. He was looking at Serafina with an expression she could not read, something fierce and possessive and achingly tender. "You saved us. Again. I don't know how many times you can pull off miracles. but I'm grateful for every single one. I'm not done yet, Seraphina said, pushing away from the wall. We still have to survive the climb down, and then find the others. And then… Alaric pulled her into his arms, cutting off her words. The embrace was sudden and overwhelming, his strength enfolding her completely. Seraphina stiffened in surprise, her Omega instincts screaming at her to submit, to lower her eyes, to pull away from this powerful alpha. But she did not pull away. Instead, she let herself sink into his warmth, let herself be held, and for just a moment, she allowed herself to believe that she was not alone anymore. "Thank you," Alaric whispered against her hair. "Thank you for surviving. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being you." Seraphina closed her eyes and breathed him in. The scent of pine and snow and something uniquely him, something that made her wolf whine and press closer. "We should go," she said, but she did not move. "In a moment," Alaric said. "Just give me a moment." They stood there on the narrow ledge as the sun began to set, two wolves clinging to each other against the vastness of the mountain, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Seraphina felt something she had thought lost forever: hope. The climb down the cliff face took hours. Seraphina led the way, testing each handhold, each foothold, calling back warnings about loose rocks and hidden ice. Her hands were raw and bleeding by the time they reached the forest below, her muscles trembling with exhaustion, but she did not allow herself to stop. Not yet. They were still too close to the ravine, too exposed to anyone who might be tracking them. They moved through the pine forest in silence, their feet crunching softly in the snow. The trees here were ancient and massive, their branches so thick overhead that very little snow had penetrated to the forest floor. It was darker here, the fading sunlight barely reaching through the canopy, but it was also safer. The scent of pine was overwhelming, masking their own scents, making them harder to track. After an hour of walking, Garrick finally spoke. "Where are we heading?" "South," Seraphina said. "Toward the settlement I told the others about. If they followed my instructions, they should be there by now. We can regroup, tend to wounds, and plan our next move." "And if they're not there?" Alaric asked. Seraphina did not answer immediately. The truth was, if the others had not made it to the settlement, there was very little she could do. She had given them the best chance she could, but in the end, survival in these mountains came down to luck as much as skill, and luck was a fickle thing. "Then we find them," she said finally, "or we die trying." The words hung heavy in the cold air, but neither Alaric nor Garrick contradicted her. They knew the stakes. They had known them from the moment they had been ambushed in the mountain pass, perhaps even before that. This was a world where death was always one mistake away, one moment of bad luck. All they could do was keep moving forward and hope that it was enough. They walked through the night, driven by desperation and the knowledge that stopping meant freezing. Seraphina's body moved on autopilot, years of survival instinct carrying her forward, even when her conscious mind wanted nothing more than to collapse. Beside her, Alaric and Garrick were equally silent, equally determined, their faces set with the grim resolve of warriors who had long ago accepted that comfort was a luxury they could not afford. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they emerged from the forest onto a ridge overlooking a small valley. And there, nestled in the valley below, was the settlement. It was small, perhaps 24 buildings clustered around a central square, smoke rising from chimneys, the warm glow of firelight visible through windows. It was a human settlement, as Seraphina had said, and it looked peaceful, untouched by the violence that had consumed their world over the past week. "There," Seraphina said, pointing to a larger building on the edge of the settlement. "That's the healer's house. If the others made it here, that's where they'll be." They descended into the valley, moving cautiously. Humans were unpredictable at the best of times, and approaching a settlement as wolves, even in human form, could provoke fear or hostility. But as they drew closer, Seraphina saw a figure emerge from the healer's house and wave frantically in their direction. It was Mira. Relief flooded through Seraphina so powerfully that her knees nearly buckled. Mira was alive, which meant the others had made it. They had survived. They hurried the last 100 yards, and Mira met them at the edge of the settlement, her face pale but smiling. "You made it," she said, her voice hoarse with emotion. "I wasn't sure you would. When we heard the collapse in the ravine—" "We're fine," Alaric said, though his voice was strained with exhaustion. "The others?" "Inside. The healer here, a woman named Martha, she's been tending to them. She asked questions, of course, but we stuck to the story. Bandits. Nothing about wolves or kings or ambushes." Mira's eyes flickered to Serafina. "She's good. Really good. Better than I expected from a human healer. She stabilized the worst of the injuries and has been keeping everyone warm and fed." "The search party?" Serafina asked. "No sign of them. Either they're still trapped on the other side of the collapse, or they gave up and went back. Either way, we're safe. For now." Serafina nodded, allowing herself to feel a small measure of relief. They had bought time. Not much, perhaps, but enough to rest, to heal, to plan. Martha turned out to be a woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She looked at the three of them as they entered her house, taking in their torn clothes, their bloodied hands, their exhausted faces, and simply nodded. "More bandit survivors, I take it," she said dryly. "Yes, ma'am," Alaric said, and Serafina was impressed by how easily he slipped into the role of a simple traveler. Nothing in his bearing suggested he was anything more than a skilled warrior down on his luck. "Well, you look like death warmed over," Martha said. "Sit. I'll get you food and water, and then we'll see about those wounds." The next few hours passed in a blur of warmth and care that Serafina had almost forgotten existed. Martha fed them hot soup and fresh bread, luxuries that brought tears to Serafina's eyes. She cleaned and bandaged their wounds with practiced efficiency, tutting over the severity of their injuries but asking no questions. And when she was done, she showed them to a room where pallets had been laid out on the floor, covered with thick blankets. "Rest," Martha said firmly. "You're no good to anyone dead on your feet. I'll keep watch. Make sure no one disturbs you." The Serafina wanted to protest, wanted to stay awake and alert for danger, but her body had other ideas. The moment she lay down on the pallet, exhaustion crashed over her like a wave, pulling her under into a deep, dreamless sleep. She woke to the sound of voices, low and urgent. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure of where she was or how she had gotten there. Then memory returned. The escape, the climb, the settlement. She sat up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles, and looked around. The room was empty except for her. The other pallets were vacant, the blankets neatly folded. Panic flared briefly before she heard the voices again, coming from the main room of the healer's house. She recognized Alaric's voice, and Mira's, and several others. Serafina stood and made her way to the doorway, peering into the main room. The warriors were gathered around a large table, and spread across its surface was a map. Alaric stood at the head of the table, his posture straight and commanding despite the bandages still visible beneath his borrowed clothes. He was speaking, his voice carrying the weight of authority she had heard in the cave. "We can't stay here," he was saying. "It's not safe for the settlement, and it's not safe for us. Our enemies will be searching, and when they don't find our bodies in the ravine, they'll expand their search. We need to move, and we need to move soon." "Move where?" Garrick asked. "We're still in no condition to travel long distances. Half of us can barely walk." "We head for the capital," Alaric said. "It's a week's journey on foot, but once we're there, we'll be safe. I have loyal forces there, people I trust absolutely. We can regroup, investigate who ordered the ambush, and plan our response." "A week's journey for healthy wolves," Mira pointed out. "For us, in our current state, it could take twice that long." "Then we take it slow," Alaric said. "We rest when we need to, we avoid populated areas, and we stay off the main roads. It's not ideal, but it's the best option we have." Serafina stepped into the room, and conversation stopped as everyone turned to look at her. She felt suddenly self-conscious under their gazes, acutely aware that she was the outsider here, the rejected Omega who had stumbled into their world by accident. "How long was I asleep?" she asked. 2 days, Alaric said, and there was something soft in his eyes when he looked at her. You needed it. You pushed yourself harder than any of us. 2 days. Serafina's mind reeled. She had never slept that long in her life, had trained herself to wake at the slightest sound, the smallest threat. The fact that she had been so deeply unconscious spoke to just how close to breaking she had been. We were just discussing our next move, Mira said, gesturing to the map. His Majesty wants to return to the capital, but we're debating the safest route. Serafina moved closer to the table, studying the map. It was well made, showing the mountains and forests of the Northern Territories in detail. She traced possible routes with her eyes, calculating distances and dangers. If you take the southern pass, she said slowly, you'll avoid most of the packed territories, but you'll be exposed on open ground for days. Too risky. The northern route goes through dense forest, which provides cover, but it's controlled by the Ironwood Pack. They're not loyal to the throne. How do you know that? One of the younger warriors asked, suspicion evident in his voice. Because I've spent 5 years avoiding pack territories, Serafina said flatly. I know which alphas are friendly, which are hostile, and which are opportunistic enough to sell information to the highest bidder. Ironwood falls into the last category. Alaric studied the map thoughtfully. What would you suggest? Serafina hesitated. They were asking her opinion, treating her as if she were one of them, as if her knowledge mattered. It was strange and uncomfortable, and oddly gratifying all at once. There's a third option, she said finally. It's longer and harder, but it's safer. You go west, into the deep wilderness. There are no pack territories there, no settlements, nothing but forest and mountains. It will take longer, maybe 2 weeks instead of 1, but you won't have to worry about being tracked or betrayed. 2 weeks through wilderness that even wolves avoid? Garrick said skeptically. That's asking for trouble of a different kind. It's asking for survival, Serafina countered. You're wounded, you're being hunted, and you can't trust the established routes. The wilderness is harsh, but it's honest. It won't betray you. It won't sell you out. It will just be what it is, and if you're smart and careful, you can navigate it. And you know how to navigate it, Alaric said. It was not a question. I do, Serafina confirmed. I've traveled through those forests more times than I can count. I know where the water sources are, where to find shelter, how to avoid the predators. I can get you through. Then that's what we'll do, Alaric said decisively. We'll take the western route, and Serafina will guide us. Your Majesty, one of the older warriors said carefully, with all due respect, are we certain we want to trust our lives to the Omega who has saved us repeatedly? Alaric interrupted, his voice cold and sharp. To the healer who kept us alive when we had no right to survive? To the wolf who led our enemies into a trap and sealed them in a mountain? Yes, I am certain. And if anyone here doubts her, they can stay behind and find their own way to the capital. Silence fell over the room, heavy and uncomfortable. The warrior who had spoken looked chastened, and several others would not meet Alaric's eyes. Serafina has earned our trust, Alaric continued, his tone softening slightly. More than that, she has earned our respect. I don't want to hear any more questions about her place in this group. She leads, we follow. Understood? Murmurs of assent rippled through the gathered wolves. Serafina felt her throat tighten with emotion. No one had ever defended her like that. No one had ever stood up for her, demanded that others treat her with dignity and respect. It was overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once. Thank you, she managed to say, the words barely above a whisper. Alaric met her eyes and smiled, a genuine warm expression that transformed his face. Thank you, he said, for everything. They spent the next day preparing for the journey. Martha provided them with supplies, dried meat, hard bread, water skins, extra blankets. She refused payment, saying only that she did not want to know what kind of bandits they were running from, and that she hoped they made it wherever they were going. As they were packing to leave, Serafina found herself alone with Alaric in the small room where they had slept. He was checking his pack, making sure everything was secure, and she stood in the doorway, watching him. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Earlier, when you defended me to the others. Alaric looked up, his golden eyes finding hers. Yes, I did, he said simply. You deserve to be defended. You deserve to be valued. And I won't let anyone treat you as less than you are. And what am I? Seraphina asked, the question escaping before she could stop it. I'm a rejected Omega with no pack, no status, no future. I'm nothing. Alaric crossed the room in 3 quick strides and took her face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the intensity in his eyes. You are everything, he said fiercely. You are strong and brave and brilliant. You have survived things that would have broken anyone else. You have shown more courage in the past week than most wolves show in their entire lives, and you are not nothing. You are— He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words, and Seraphina felt her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break free from her chest. You are mine, Alaric said finally, his voice rough with emotion. If you'll have me. I know I have no right to claim you. I know the world would say it's impossible, but I don't care. From the moment I saw you in that cave, from the moment you chose to help us when you had every reason to walk away, I felt it. The bond. The connection. You're my mate, Seraphina, my true mate, and I will spend the rest of my life proving to you that you are worthy of being loved. Seraphina felt tears streaming down her face, hot and unchecked. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that it was impossible, that an Alpha King could not mate with a rejected Omega. She wanted to tell him all the reasons why it would never work, why they came from different worlds, why she would only bring him pain and complications. But instead, she whispered, I felt it too. And then Alaric was kissing her, his lips claiming hers with a desperate hunger that made her wolf sing with joy. She kissed him back, pouring 5 years of loneliness and longing into the embrace, letting herself believe, just for this moment, that maybe, just maybe she deserved this happiness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alaric rested his forehead against hers. When we reach the capital, he said, I'm going to claim you properly, in front of the entire court, in front of the council, in front of everyone who ever said an Omega wasn't worthy. I'm going to make you my Luna, and I'm going to change every law that allowed you to suffer. They'll fight you, Seraphina warned. The council, the Alphas, everyone with power will see me as a threat to the established order. Let them fight, Alaric said. I didn't become Alpha King by backing down from challenges. And I won't start now, not when it comes to you. Seraphina smiled through her tears and pulled him into another kiss, sealing the promise between them. Outside, she could hear the others preparing to leave, the sounds of packs being shouldered and final goodbyes being said. Their journey was about to begin, a journey that would take them through wilderness and danger, toward a capital city where political machinations and ancient prejudices waited. But for now, in this small room in a human settlement at the edge of the world, Seraphina allowed herself to be happy, to be loved, to be wanted. She was no longer alone, and that made all the difference.